Seems fantastic.
Very.
How much sun have you all had?
Content.
So much sun.
Yeah.
So much sun.
Yeah. How many martinis have you had today as well?
I haven't had a single martini today, and this is in fact my first glass of wine.
Ah.
What about the rest of it, though?
No, I've been very good today. I've had water and coffee.
Well done.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's been a real struggle. Sean, I'm not a complete lush. Don't get carried away with the wrong idea that I spend all my time lying in the sun drinking martinis.
I thought you were a lady of leisure.
Not today. I've been frantically trying to finish this friggin' story.
Oh, you haven't finished it?
Quality Lord of the Rings content.
Oh my god, yes.
What's that?
Oh no, Zach, don't, because I've only just stopped crying.
There's like a cast reunion video that went up on YouTube today.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's sweet.
fantastic.
Oh.
I'll get back to you, Frankie. Nick showed me my first episode of Buffy today.
How did it go? How did it land?
I enjoyed it.
Because it starts
Well done, Nick.
streaming on Monday, I think, on E4, doesn't it? Or have you downloaded it or something? Or?
Downloaded it.
Aha. Great.
Do you fancy Giles yet?
I mean, who doesn't?
Obviously.
I mean, we've only seen the first episode. I think it's, when Giles gets a bit more badass is when you start to be like, oh yes.
I mean, he's a librarian.
I don't remember him getting that badass, to be honest.
How dare you?
Excuse me?
Badass.
Okay, as far as
Say that,
librarians go,
that's
yeah, he's badass.
It's the most badass kind of person there is. Anyone more badass than librarians?
I brought my parents back and they can make noises now.
Hello! Hello, Mummy and Daddy Katie. Lovely to have you along. Oh, this is so exciting.
They were seduced by me telling them tales every time they call of, what have you been doing? Well, I've been listening to Frankie tell stories. And then they joined in and it was Gordon telling stories. So I said they have to
Oh, pressure's on now. Gordon set a dangerously high bar in terms of storytelling. So, well, this has turned out to be a little longer than I was intending that it would be. It should still be fine. It's probably going to be maybe about an hour. It might be the full hour. Is that going to be okay?
That's impressive, Frankie. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it might not. Maybe that's me massively overestimating how long it will take to read this. But I want to kind of front end this with caveats, just in case it gets to 10 o'clock and you're all like, "Gosh, she's still going on this flipping snail."
Well, snails are slow. You can't hurry them up. That's just their natural speed.
And you know when usually you stop and everyone goes, more. Like,
So you can pretend to drop one of those in halfway through if you want. We'll
Halfway through, I'll kind of like wave, and at that point, everyone go like, more, and make lots of gestures. Hi, Em. Hey, everybody. Hi, Robert.
Hello.
Hi, Gordon.
hey, Gordon.
Hi, Gordon. Hi, Sweet Pea. Hey, Andrada.
Hi.
Gordon, I feel like your hair is growing faster than anybody else's hair in lockdown.
It's gone a bit odd. I'm not sure what to do.
It's
It's
cute.
just-
Have you got some product on?
It's still
very
far.
cute. You look all like fluffy and cozy and cuddleable.
Like a little sheep.
Teddy bear.
It's like that.
Hey, Lisa.
Lisa here. Hey, Lisa.
Hey.
Hey, baby girl.
Hey.
Hey.
Totally agreed about Gordon's hair. Other than the length thing, I might be able to challenge that. I cut mine just above my chin at the start of lockdown. So I have like a very clear measurement.
What?
Yeah, I have no idea what happened.
Oh my god.
Oh.
I think it's because you think so hard. Like your brain is such a kind of hive of activity, and it gets so warm that it just extrudes your hair super fast out. You remember, you know, when you like push Play-Doh through one of those kind of spaghetti things?
Like a garlic crusher.
The mop
Like
top
a
hair
garlic
shop. That's
crusher.
called.
That's how hair works.
Clearly, I need to stop thinking so much, maybe.
And I need to think more. I mean, I challenge you to see any difference in my hair from the first day of chocolate.
I feel like that's cheating because your hair is just so beautiful that, like, it's not a kind of, oh, you know, yeah, it's definitely looking more like raggedy and weird than it was at the beginning or anything. Like my hair, like your hair just always looks gorgeous.
I mean, have you seen Shri? She's got like waist-length curls now.
Wow.
She is a princess.
She is.
She is a princess, and she looks it.
Those photos of her on the beach from her birthday, she looks like a goddess.
Mm-hmm. God, she's so gorgeous. What a beautiful woman.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to tell her this conversation happened if somebody else doesn't get it first. To make sure we do this.
It's recording. Shall I just like cut this snippet out and send it to her? So, Shri, like, I don't want to be weird about this, but we're all super into you.
Love you, Shri.
Love you, Shri. Love you, Shri.
Love you, Shri.
Cute. Very cute.
You can start an equivalent in yoga time about you, it's fine.
Story time?
Hmm? Story time.
Getting there.
8 minutes past.
I heard rumors that it's quite a slow-paced one that's going to last forever. Was that right when I just arrived?
Yes. It's yeah, I mean, should we just start?
No, Nick needs to come back.
Oh, Malcolm's just joining. Wait for Malcolm.
Hi, Malcolm.
Just joined.
Yay, just in time, mate. Brilliant.
Hi, darling.
The plants are looking healthy.
My ones.
Yeah.
Although they are definitely needing a water. I didn't do that today. Instead, I drank wine.
Maybe you need watering too.
How was your afternoon of wine drinking?
It was quite splendid. I was talking to a person.
A real person?
Yeah.
A 3D person?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. You know, at a reasonable distance. And then 2 friends of mine just happened to walk by, so they sat down for a little while as well. So that's slightly in excess, but at the same time, it's quite hard to say, no, please don't sit down.
Well, I hope you've washed your hands before coming on the call with all of us.
Oh.
I like the idea that the etiquette has changed from please sit down to please stay standing away from me.
Right, do we have Nick back? Do we have a Nick back?
Yeah, I'm here. Story time.
Story time. So yeah, this is I wrote this and haven't read the whole thing through again since I finished it or edited it at all.
That's okay. It was the same with the dragon, and that was great.
Okay. Okay, I hope it's all right. It's very
going to be amazing.
I mean, we got unedited Frankie all the time, and we love it. So.
Howard.
He's very lucky.
I can't believe how excited we are. Yeah.
Okay, I'm really excited. Oh God, I hope you like it. Right, so, okay, we will start this. I shall meet everybody. Okay, so this doesn't have a title yet. Let's call it The Snail. And it's a story about art and friendship and the meaning of home. I really hope at least one person cries. Now, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Once upon a time, there was a snail who was a house painter. Now, I know how that sounds, but it's true. He was a master at it. He was one of the most hotly demanded house painters in the business. In fact, he wasn't just a house painter, he was an artist. Of course, he didn't start as an artist, no artist does. He got his first painting gig as part of a house painting team, and they were the best in the business. They had been the best in the business even before the snail joined their ranks, and once he came on board, they were unstoppable. The elephant was the founder of the team, and she was still the heart and head of the business. She had originally been a sole trader, painting houses on her own all over the community. She would take a large, deliberate trunk full of paint from one of the 2 buckets she carried slung over her back, take careful aim, and then release a powerful, colourful jet of paint with the force of a fireman's hose all over the wall. It was a very efficient method, and the elephant could paint an entire house in a few short hours. She was a sweet, neurotic animal and scrupulously fair in her estimates, so word spread quickly and demand for her services rose. This made the elephant very happy, but it also worried her. She knew that the one problem with her technique was that it was not very neat. Her method worked because she got the paint everywhere, but on the other hand, the paint got everywhere. As requests for house painting began to pour in from fancier and fancier residences with manicured lawns and balconies and bay windows, she knew that she would need to find a way to adapt her approach. She went out and bought 5 pints of Ben & Jerry's peanut butter cup ice cream and lined them all up in front of her and opened the lids, and she began to eat from left to right. This was how she always tackled any problems that needed serious thinking about, and it never failed her yet. About halfway through the second tub, she thought, my success as a house painter is based on my unique method. That is what my business is founded upon. Rather than changing my method to suit the houses, wouldn't it be better to change the houses to suit my method? This seemed like a promising train of thought, so she pursued it through the rest of the second tub and most of the third. At the beginning of the fourth tub, she thought, what they want me to do is paint the walls, but not the windows or the doors or the flower beds or the roof. What I need is to cover up the windows and the doors and the flower beds and the roof, and then I can paint the whole lot as usual and not have to worry about being neat. But how? My trunk is perfect for blowing paint, but not good at masking off architectural features. I would need someone to help me. She ate a few more scoops of ice cream, pensively crunching the peanut chunks. But if I'm going to get someone to help me, why not get someone who could do the whole job? Someone more nimble and dexterous than me, someone good at climbing who could do with steady work. She upended the last melted drops of ice cream from the fourth tub into her mouth, wiped her trunk and reached for her phone to call a chimpanzee she'd met in art school. It took a while for the chimp to pick up, but when he did, he was delighted to hear from her. They'd always been good friends, though they hadn't spoken in a year or 2. The chimpanzee was quite high, and it took a while for him to get the gist of what the elephant was proposing, but she explained patiently, and the message got through eventually. The chimp told her cheerfully that she was a sellout trying to trap him into bourgeois wage slavery and that he would never betray his art. The elephant agreed and told him that the next job was on Thursday. Cool, said the chimp. And by the time the elephant had finished the 5th tub of ice cream and put the phone down, she had a prep guy. Within a week, the elephant knew that her 5-pint technique had worked wonders again. She and the chimpanzee quickly worked out their system. He would arrive at a job in the morning and mask off the windows, doors, and any other parts of the house that didn't want painting. He would lay tarpaulins over the roof and dust sheets on the ground all around the house, and then would wander away and find a patch of sun to snooze in. The elephant would arrive with her paint buckets, paint all the walls with her usual quick efficiency, and then they would sit and crack open a beer together and argue amiably about postmodernism while the paint dried. Then the elephant would help the chimp unmask the house and take down the paint-spattered tarpaulins. The chimpanzee was always late and sometimes still a little stoned, but he worked hard and had no problems with taking the elephant's instructions. Business boomed. Emboldened by the success of her first foray into recruitment, it wasn't long before the elephant started thinking again about new ways to expand the business. The part of the job that took the longest was definitely the covering of the roof with the tarpaulins. The chimpanzee never complained, but as the jobs and the houses got larger and the number of windows and doors that needed covering increased, the elephant began to wonder if there was a way to do away with the task of tarping the roof altogether. The experience of running a startup must have been developing the elephant's problem-solving capabilities, because it only took 3 tubs of Ben & Jerry's peanut butter cup ice cream for her to come up with the answer. Now, in the small world of professional home improvements, everybody knows everybody else. At a networking event for female entrepreneurs several months previously, the elephant had met a zebra who ran a 2-man band window washing concern in the area, employing a giraffe on a part-time basis to help with the upper windows. Now, the elephant had heard on the grapevine that the zebra was thinking of winding up the business and taking a computer science qualification at the local college. So she ate a little more ice cream to give herself courage, flapped her ears nervously, and got in touch with the zebra to ask if she'd be prepared to set up an introduction between the elephant and the giraffe. The zebra was perfectly happy to do so, and the next day the elephant had a brief but cordial chat with the giraffe that ended in her offering him a job opportunity with her team, an offer that the giraffe accepted with a slight stiffness that didn't conceal his obvious relief. He was an early retiree who lived alone and who had taken the window washing job more for some occupation and company than for anything else. The elephant was at first a little intimidated by his stern manner and his habit of raising his chin and peering sideways down at whoever was speaking to him. But although gruff and slightly old-fashioned, he was good-hearted and touchingly grateful to be part of a team once more. With the giraffe on board, the chimpanzee no longer needed to cover the roofs of the houses they painted. The elephant would simply aim her jets of paint a little lower so that they didn't reach all the way to the top of the wall, and while she worked her way around the house, the giraffe followed behind her. He would hold the handle of the brush in his tough, mobile mouth and sweep it slowly and deliberately from side to side in firm, methodical strokes, painting in the gap that was left between the newly painted area and the eaves. Once the elephant had finished her part of the job, she would come and stand next to him before she went to join the chimpanzee on break, looking along the neat, even line below the roof's overhang. "Nice work," she would say. The giraffe would mutter and disclaim that he had never been artistic, looking at his careful work with pride. He could never be prevailed upon to join the elephant and the chimp in their beers, but he began to bring along a flask of hot, sweet tea and would often nod off in the sun while they bickered happily to and fro. The addition of the giraffe to the team meant that there were practically no houses they couldn't paint. Over the next few months, the business went from strength to strength. They painted bijou cottages and smart townhouses and low, wide bungalows. One week they painted a single house in the middle of a terrace, which the chimpanzee carefully masked off from the houses on either side. And the next week received a collective request from all the other residents of the terrace to come back and paint all of their houses in different colours too. They painted kennels and caravans and hutches. They painted wasps' nests and termite mounds, and once the inside of a large echoing cave. It was when they were painting the outside of a small municipal multi-storey car park that they met the Snail. He was working as an independent contractor at the time, repainting the lines between the parking spaces that had got worn and faded. He had a small wheeled hopper which attached to his shell with suction cups, and which released a slow stream of paint behind him as he trailed along. It was slow work, but he was good at it. He had a gift for the linear, and the lines he painted were always as straight as arrows, without curve or wobble anywhere along their length. It was the chimpanzee who first noticed him. There wasn't much for the chimp to do on this job. He had masked off the door to the manager's office and the fire exit door and the big sign by the entrance displaying the opening hours and ticket prices, and that was about it. The elephant had insisted it was too early to start on the beer, and there was no grass outside to snooze on, so he had come for a wander around inside. Seeing the snail at work, he perched himself on a nearby railing to watch him. After a while, he said, with genuine appreciation, "Nice, man." The snail looked up, startled but pleased. "Thanks." The chimp swung back and forth a few times, then hopped down and came closer. "Real clean lines. Minimalist, yeah? Some good Mondrian shit." The snail flushed. They're just straight lines. They're so straight, dude, the chimp insisted. They're like platonically straight, you know? The snail didn't know, but he was pleased by the obvious enthusiasm from a member of such a well-renowned team. The chimp regarded his work for a moment longer, then loped over to the low wall of the car park and stuck his head out. Yo, L, G-Man, come look at this. Before the snail knew what was happening, the elephant and the giraffe were peering in at him from outside. He shrank back a little inside his shell, but the chimp was already enthusiastically pointing out his painting to the other two. Check out these lines, man, he was saying. This little dude is doing some real sick line work in here. The elephant and the giraffe peered closer, and they both admired the beautiful straightness and simplicity of the snail's lines. A talent, sir, said the giraffe, peering sternly sideways down at the snail. I myself have never been artistic, but I know talent when I see it. There is nothing so beautiful as a clean, straight line, no sir. Bravo, top-notch work. The snail blushed all along his length and shuffled his foot. The elephant smiled at him. They're right, you know. That's a real skill you've got there. I could never paint anything half so neat. She looked at the long row of sharp, careful lines and at the wheeled hopper attached to the snail's shell. She hadn't had even one tub of Ben & Jerry's peanut buttercup ice cream, but nevertheless she felt an idea begin to form in her mind. Hey, are you due a break at all? The snail, still feeling shy but encouraged by her kind manner, nodded. You want to join us for a beer? Asked the elephant. And so the snail found himself sitting in the shade of a parked van, sipping beer from an upturned bottle cap with the best house painting team on the scene. He felt a little overwhelmed at first, but the relaxed, friendly atmosphere of the group soon put him at his ease, and soon he felt as though he'd known them for ages. When the break was over and the others went to begin finishing up, the elephant hung back. Listen, she said, how would you feel about coming to work with us? The snail choked on his last mouthful of beer. The elephant patted him on the shell as delicately as she could with the tip of her trunk, and while he coughed, she went on. I know this is pretty out of the blue and would be a bit of a shift for you career-wise. If you don't fancy it, that's completely fine, but I meant what I said. You've got a real skill, and I think we could use that kind of skill on the team. We can paint any house, any colour, and do a great job of it. But with your help, we could offer a level of detail that I think some of our bigger customers in particular would love. She flapped her ears and smiled a little nervously. No need to decide now, obviously, but just have a think. I'd love to, said the snail hoarsely, his eyes still watering a little. That sounds... I'd love to. The elephant beamed. And so it was that the snail joined this team of elite house painters as their official line man, painting straight, precise lines in complementary shades along the edges of window frames and cornicing and around moulded features. Since his wheel hopper wouldn't work on vertical surfaces, the chimpanzee would dip his foot in the paint and place him carefully on the wall, where he would slowly and steadily work his way along. Initially, he would be taken off and re-dipped into the paint every so often, but they discovered it was more efficient as well as pleasanter for him to simply eat some of the dry powdered paint. The elephant had checked and triple-checked that it was non-toxic, and she still fretted about the idea until after several jobs had gone by with no ill effects, which then altered the colour of the trail he left behind him. It wasn't long before the elephant was proved right in her prediction. The touch of extra detail that his service provided was very popular, and the business became so successful that the elephant had to hire an accountant, an ant named Rodney, who filed their tax returns and took care of the back office, so the elephant could concentrate on painting full time. The snail was happier than he'd ever been. He'd taken pride in doing a good job on his car parks, but the work had been repetitive and unfulfilling. He'd never thought of himself as an artist, but the variety and interest that this new task brought to him, as well as the unfailing encouragement and enthusiasm of the others, began to open new vistas inside him. He began to observe and understand the lines of his own making, not only as individual units, but as a complete whole. This door frame wasn't simply a case of two long lines and one short one. The lines were connected, meeting like old friends on a street corner. The beauty of their angle somehow formed by and yet separate from the different beauty of their straightness. This row of windows, each one a tall rectangle, was both a collection of parts and a whole, a triptych of identical shapes that were somehow both the same as and distinct from one another, each understandable both as a mirror and copy of the one beside it, and as a unique entity, defined not by its form, but by its location in space. These were strange new ideas for the snail, and he wasn't entirely certain what he meant by them. He tried tentatively to express some of his thoughts to the chimpanzee one day when he came to move the snail from a completed cornice to the edge of a large window box. The chimp began talking about form and mimesis and Andy Warhol and geometric abstraction, and made a lot of energetic gestures with the hand holding the snail, until the snail started to feel both very confused and a bit sick and had to ask to be put down. But for all he didn't understand a lot of what the elephant and the chimpanzee talked about during their afternoon beer breaks, the snail could feel something within himself shifting and expanding, his mind filling with vague new conceptions and feelings that slowly developed into a strange and undefined yearning. He still loved his work and had developed an appreciation for line and curve and angle that glowed in fascinating shapes inside his head. But these shapes were still set for him, his work constrained by the edges and frames and features of the houses they painted. The snail felt that wings were growing inside his shell, tightly furled, and he longed for a chance to stretch them and take flight, to create fascinating shapes of his own. Little did the snail know that his artistic breakthrough was about to come. It came, in fact, as so many breakthroughs do, entirely by accident. They were working a big job, a large and architecturally ambitious house on the outskirts of town. The architect seemed to have chosen to combine an entire house's worth of windows into a single feature, and the building was composed on 3 sides of smooth, blank concrete walls, with the front erupting into an extravagant concoction of swooping glass that reached from the ground right up to the back-sloping roof. The chimpanzee had sworn colourfully and at length when he saw it, and it had taken 3 times as long to mask off all the irregularly shaped panes as it had to paint the whole building. The elephant and the giraffe were soon done, and sat down cheerfully with the chimpanzee to wait for the snail to finish. His task was also an unusually simple one that day. Apart from the front door, which he had dutifully outlined in a bright cobalt blue, the team had recently switched their powdered paint supplier to a new brand, and it was the snail's first time using this particular shade. There was only the long, straight line running along the edge of the roof for him to do. It wasn't a complex line, but it was a long one. The house was very large, and by the time the elephant and the giraffe had finished the 3rd wall and come to join the chimp in the sun, the snail had only just disappeared around the corner of the first. The rest of the team lay back at their ease on the white speckled dust sheets, chatting and heaping good-natured abuse on the vision of the unknown architect. The shadow of the tree behind them moved gradually across the ground, and they began to place idle bets on the point it would have reached when the snail emerged around the other corner of the roof. The elephant frowned. He has been gone a while, actually, hasn't he? I know it's a big house, but I wouldn't have thought it would take him this long. Well, it's very warm, you know, remarked the giraffe languidly, tilting the last drops of tea onto his long black tongue. Awfully warm. Slow going on a warm day like this, what? I hadn't thought about that. I hope he's okay in this heat. The chimp waved an empty beer bottle at her. He'll be fine. He's got his own little house right there, man. Maybe he went in for a nap. The elephant got to her feet. I'm going to go check on him, just to be sure. By Jove, I hope the little fellow hasn't got sunstroke, said the giraffe, heaving himself to his feet as well. The chimp groaned, but got up too, and the 3 of them followed the straight, neat line of cobalt blue around to the back of the house. The elephant gasped. The giraffe dropped his thermos flask. The chimpanzee said, "Whoa." The snail was feeling very peculiar. He wasn't quite sure when it had begun. He'd been fine earlier. He remembered painting around the door, and then the chimp bringing him a covert sip of beer and a fresh meal of paint powder before he began the big job. He'd been wilting a little in the heat, but the beer had perked him back up, and he'd set off briskly along the edge of the roof. But that seemed as though it had been a long time ago, perhaps several years ago, or sometime in his early childhood. He told himself it only seemed that way because the roof was so long, but he didn't remember it being this long, or being such a peculiar shape. He'd thought it was a simple straight edge, but actually it was full of dips and angles and complicated pointy bits. No wonder it was taking him so long. He thought that he might have been lonely, trekking on this strange path for so many centuries, but fortunately there was another snail there with him, a huge black snail that trailed away just in front of him, its shell stretching and lengthening oddly. He hurried to try and catch up with it, but it quickened its pace too and stayed just ahead of him, and together they pressed on along the spiralling edge of the roof that bent gently to the left in an endless but gradually tightening curve, so that the snail expected at any moment to come up on himself again from behind. At least then this black snail would have to stop, he thought. It certainly has some stamina in it. And the line it's painting is so perfectly straight. I wonder if the elephant would let it join the team. Someone was picking him up and laying him gently on a cool patch of grass. "Give him some beer," he heard a voice saying from very far away. "Don't give him beer," snapped another voice, one he was sure he recognised. "Honestly, look at him. It must have been that new blue. He's completely out of it. The last thing he needs now is beer." "No, seriously," insisted the first voice, which the snail now thought might belong to a chimpanzee. "I've been there, man. It's a whole trip. He needs a beer. It does something with, like, enzymes. Wash that shit out of his system, yeah?" "He probably should drink something, you know. I'm afraid I haven't any tea left, or we could give the poor little chap..." There was a wash of cool air across the snail's face, as if someone was fanning him gently with her ears. He peered up blearily at the elephant. "Beer?" 3 huge faces looked down at him, 2 worried, 1 interested. The elephant bit her lip. "Oh, all right then." The chimp held a capful of beer gently to the snail's mouth, and he slurped it eagerly as the world began to come back into focus. "Are you all right?" asked the elephant, her voice full of concern. The snail was feeling much better now and told her so. "What did you see, man?" said the chimp eagerly, leaning close. "Where did it take you?" Snail gazed up at him, perplexed. He didn't understand. He hadn't gone anywhere, only along the edge of the roof, like always. "No, dude." Ignoring the elephant's shushing, the chimpanzee picked the snail up and sat him on one leathery palm to look back at the blank white wall of the house. "You went deep." The wall stretched wide and blinding in the late sun, but it wasn't blank anymore. It was covered in blue lines, winding and zigzagging and stretching back and forth and up and down and along. There were a series of perfect squares, tilted and offset from one another like a stack of boxes captured in the midst of falling. There was a patch of overlapping loops and swirls that looked like a riverbed of smooth pebbles seen through clear water. There was a spiky, irregular, pendulous shape, like the chrysalis of some fantastical caterpillar. All linked together, all formed in one smooth, uninterrupted line of bright cobalt blue, as if drawn by a fountain pen. The line finished in the very centre of the wall, in a round, flawlessly symmetrical circle that looked a little thicker and darker than the rest of the lines, as if the fountain pen had drawn it over and over again. "Did I do that?" asked the snail, appalled. "That's magnificent," interrupted the giraffe. "I myself have never been artistic, as you know, but even I can see that this is a great work. Yes, a great work, sir." The chimp nodded enthusiastically. "It's wild, man. Totally wild. Visionary, you know. Francis Bacon vibes." The snail looked at the wall again, unable to believe that he had produced the towering, profound shapes and forms that seemed to tell a story in a language he was just on the cusp of understanding. He felt a bubble of pride begin to form in his chest. Then he looked up quickly at the elephant. "But the owner, it's not what they wanted. They might not. We should paint over it." He trailed off. The elephant was gazing at the wall too, frowning. Then she looked down at him. "Let's wait and see what they say. You're right, it's not what they asked for, and they might not want their house to look like this." She smiled at the snail. "But we should at least give them the option of keeping the first masterpiece of an emerging artistic talent." The snail blinked his bloodshot eyes very rapidly and ducked shyly back into his shell. In the end, he needn't have worried. The owner of the house, a large badger who spent much of her late husband's money on patronising the arts, went into transports of delight when the elephant led her nervously around the back of the house. Clasping her shovel-like paws to her hairy bosom, she gushed over the primal symbolism and talismanic energy of the piece. "Like the NASCAR lines, darling," she exclaimed, her silk turban slightly askew. "Like the Uffington horse." "All her bougie friends are going to want one now," whispered the chimp as they trudged down the long drive, laden with folded dust sheets. "You watch, man. You'll be chewing so much blue your shell will glow." But at this, the elephant put her foot down. "No more of that blue," she said sternly, glaring at the chimp. "God knows what's in it, but it's clearly unsafe. I'll be having words with the supplier. Their standards of what counts as non-toxic are far too—" "I don't think I need the blue," said the snail shyly. He could feel the wings inside him beating strong and steady, and his mind was a whirl of shapes lighting up the dark. I think I can do it on my own." "Of course you can," said the elephant gently. As it turns out, they were all right. The badger immediately threw a soiree for 30 or 40 of her most intimate friends to show off her new artwork, and before the night was over, several of them had sneaked off into the bushes to phone the elephant and request the team's house painting services at the first possible opportunity. Within a week, the elephant had to stop accepting jobs for the time being as their diary was so packed, and Rodney the ant was putting in overtime just to keep up with the invoicing. The snail's confidence grew and grew. His belief in himself as an artist, faint and wavering to begin with, glowed and kindled with each new job into a strong, bright flame that burned joyfully within him. The team's first commission for a snail original work was for a beaver who worked in the city, who wanted his sprawling country dam freshened up with a new coat of paint. The beaver's son, a young person of bohemian tendencies, had been at the badger's party and very much admired her latest showpiece. And when he realised that his father had booked the same team, he demanded that the snail should be allowed absolutely free rein for his artistic vision. The father, who had no particular interest in art, said that as long as his free rein didn't take him outside the confines of the East Wing, the snail could do what he liked with his artistic vision. And so the snail, very nervous but encouraged by his team and by the enthusiastic twitterings of the young beaver, gulped down a bowl of warm umber paint powder and sallied forth in a twining, winding, flowing path that wove around the logs of the dam like ribbons around a maypole, creating a subtle rippling pattern like a flowing stream blended with the banded grain of wood. He felt that perhaps he should have included at least a few straight lines, since they were his stock in trade, but their neat, scrupulous precision didn't seem right for this job. He finished his final flourishing swoop with another perfect circle and looked anxiously to his patron for approval. The young beaver was even more delighted than the badger had been, burst into floods of praise, and finally, since he was not able to shake the snail's hand, seized the chimpanzee's paw and began enthusiastically wringing it. The next job was for an aging and imperious dowager peacock, whose summer house the snail decorated with neat bands of interlocking squares and hexagons in a shimmering purple, and who was so pleased with the result that she very nearly smiled. After that, it was a mural on the side of a local school, The elephant was firm that they would continue to work small and community jobs too, despite all the chimp's dark mutterings about becoming lackeys of the second estate. And after that, a windmill that had been converted into a co-living space for young professional squirrels. In each place, the team carried out the masking and painting as they always had, the snail still completing his usual line work around lintels and windowsills. Then, once all the walls were painted, once the canvas is prepared, as the giraffe insisted on putting it, the chimp would place the snail carefully in his desired starting spot, and the rest of the team would retire to a discreet distance to relax while he began to paint. They kept their chatter to a respectful volume, but within minutes the snail stopped hearing them anyway, swept away to that vast, luminous space where the lines spun themselves out into an endless kaleidoscope of possibilities. Inspired by his work on the beaver's dam, which had so reflected the harmony of wood and sunlit water that surrounded it, the snail began consciously adapting his ideas to each house they painted. Elements of its form and use made their way into the patterns and shapes he created, and often aspects of the owners themselves were represented, although always in an abstract way that probably none but the snail himself would recognize. It brought him great joy to feel that he was thus expressing not only his own creativity, but something of the unique personality of the houses and the lives lived in them. The genuine delight on their clients' faces when they saw their beloved homes transformed was all the reward the snail needed. As he told the elephant when she came to him, ears flapping nervously, and told him that if he wanted to pursue a solo artistic career, she would completely understand. "You're so talented," she said. "We do good work, I know we do, but we're in such high demand now, and that's all because of you. I don't want to start charging higher rates or only working for prestige customers, but I also don't want to hold you back. This could be your big break. So few artists get the chance for this kind of commercial success. I hope you know we wouldn't blame you at all if you wanted to start taking private commissions instead of carrying on painting houses with us." "I like painting houses," the snail assured her earnestly. "I'm really happy that people like what I'm doing, but I don't want to leave the team. You've already given me my big break. I love what we do, and I'm not interested in private commissions." The elephant flushed. "Thank you," she said, curling her trunk into a knot of embarrassed pleasure. "But actually, there was one private commission at least I was sort of hoping you'd take. I don't suppose you've got such a unique gift, and I really do love your work. Would you be at all interested in painting something for me on my house?" The snail blushed all along his whole body, and his eye stalks waved excitedly. "It would be an honor," he said. He flatly refused to accept any payment for the job, despite the elephant's insistence. "You're my friend," he told her. "If you like my work, let me give it to you as a present." "But," began the elephant, "and if you try and add anything onto my paycheck, I'll get Rodney to transfer it straight back to you with interest," the snail said firmly. "Please." Reluctantly, the elephant conceded. "Okay, but I'm getting the beers in. Proper craft stuff." To this, the snail agreed gladly, and the next Saturday, the chimp called round to take him to the elephant's house. She lived in a large, half-converted barn on a quiet suburban street. There was a group of children kicking a football about in the middle of the road, who scattered as the chimp's ancient Vespa ploughed towards them, backfiring loudly. The elephant met them at the door, apologising for the jumble of tools and bricks in the garden. "I've been in the middle of converting this place for about 4 years, and somehow I never seem to get any further on with it," and showed them around the back to a tall expanse of sturdy, weather-worn timber with a single small window set high up in it like a porthole. "I haven't put a base on it because, well, the texture and the colour of the wood is so lovely, but do you think that will be all right for you to work on? I don't want you to get any splinters." The snail assured her that he would be just fine, and after gazing meditatively at the elephant's house for a while, he selected a simple white paint powder and asked the chimp to place him in the bottom right corner of the wall. He had been a bit worried about creating something not just for a job, but for a friend. What if she didn't like it? What if he couldn't think of anything to paint at all? But as soon as he felt the smooth, undulating surface of the wood beneath his foot, the lines leapt into life before him so strongly and vividly he felt he could almost see them, as if all he needed to do was follow where they led. The world receded, but this time he didn't ignore it completely. In the background, he could hear the hum and patter of the elephant's voice as she joked with the chimp, and her warm laughter purred around inside his shell like a little engine powering him along. The giraffe arrived halfway through the afternoon, hot and harried, muttering about trouble with his bus pass, but his explanation trailed off when he got to the back of the house. The warm, variegated planks shone chestnut and honey in between lines of solid white. A thick, blocky zigzag pattern ran right up the side of the wall, almost to the roof, then twisted at the top and spread back out and down in rounded, forking paths like the branches of a baobab tree. Each branching line was tipped with a small loop, often placed so that they framed a knot in the wood's grain, like a kind, dark eye bracketed with soft wrinkles. The last line was almost back at the base of the wall, but instead of looping it off, the snail had drawn it out into a long series of crisp, oblong shapes, all different sizes and dimensions, which projected up from the ground level like the skyline of some great city, as though all the houses the elephant had ever painted had come to stand together, side by side, beneath the sheltering embrace of the great tree. The giraffe swallowed rather hard, and for once accepted a beer from the chimp without comment. The snail finished the final oblong with a long, swirling curve like an artist's brushstroke, and completed it with the perfectly round circle that had become his trademark signature, just as the light was fading. The chimp set him down beside a small dipping bowl full of IPA, and then he and the elephant and the giraffe stood back and gazed at the snail's work. The elephant's eyes were full of tears. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. I love it." "A masterpiece," croaked the giraffe. "Truly a masterpiece, sir. I myself am not artistic, but even if I were, I could not hope to create such a work." Beside him, the chimp was nodding fervently, his half-drunk beer sloshing foam onto the ground. Paint spattered and elated, the snail looked up at their proud, beaming faces, his friends. "You know," he said, attempting diffidence, "if you guys ever wanted anything doing on your houses too..." He had barely finished speaking before the giraffe and the chimpanzee were both hopping about excitedly, plainly thrilled at the idea. "Are you sure, dear boy?" asked the giraffe. "You really don't have to, you know. A great artist." "I want to," said the snail firmly. And so, the very next weekend, the whole team assembled at the giraffe's neat bungalow, the echoing bangs of the chimp's vesper drawing scandalised looks over several privet hedges. Out of deference to the giraffe's tastes, they hadn't brought any beer with them. He made them all strong, sweet tea in chipped Jubilee mugs, with a willow pattern saucerful for the snail, and took them into the back garden to show them his rose bushes. The elephant had brought along Rodney the ant this time too, and he perched on a sugar lump and peered at the warm, rosy brick of the garden wall. "Is this where you were thinking of for the painting?" The giraffe nodded and harumphed and said that he had thought it might be a suitable spot, and the snail selected a soft, greyish-purple heather colour and set to work. He painted in a clockwise direction, up and along and down and back, building a neat, regular herringbone pattern of rectangles like a parquet floor along each side of the wall. Towards the centre, however, the blocks began to give out, as though the floorboards had been pulled up in a wide circle starting from the middle. Into this blank space, the snail painted a single straight line, which wavered a little and then began to undulate into curves. Larger and larger the curves became, and the line snaked back and forth around the inside of the circle until it met its own course again and began to spiral in towards the centre. The waves gradually diminished and flattened out as the spiral contracted, until finally the line completed itself, quietly and naturally, in the snail's signature perfect circle at the very centre of the wall. It was a clean, elegant design, but the painstaking execution of the herringbone pattern had taken a long time, and Rodney, the elephant, and the chimpanzee were all snoozing on the grass by the time the piece was finished. The giraffe had watched the entire process, however, rapt and absorbed, and when the last circle was complete, he burst into applause, startling the others awake and making Rodney topple off his sugar lump. "Bravo, sir," cried the giraffe huskily, his voice quavering with emotion. "Once more, a masterpiece. Such artistry, such discernment. Why, even I can see it, though, as you know, I myself am not artistic," finished the chimp, grinning and poking the giraffe with a friendly elbow. "Real nice work, man. Rad use of space. Can't wait to see what you come up with for me, Casa." The chimp turned out to live in a tall, dilapidated townhouse on the grungy side of town, which he shared with 3 meerkats, a water buffalo, a heavily tattooed gorilla, a flock of colourful parakeets, and an elderly toucan. He hadn't asked any of his fellow residents for permission to paint the house, or in fact mentioned it to them at all, but seemed perfectly unconcerned. "It's cool, man. No rules, just rights. Freedom of artistic expression, yeah? It's not like anybody actually, owns the place." The snail felt slightly dubious about this part, even though the building had clearly been derelict for some years. The 2 meerkats eating leftover pizza at the kitchen table when they trooped in seemed perfectly amenable, however, and the gorilla was so taken with the idea that he abandoned his mixing bowl of hash brownie batter on the counter and came outside in his ratty pink apron to watch the snail work. "What colour would you like it?" asked the snail. He had asked the elephant to bring a variety of their brightest pigments, as he wasn't quite sure what would suit the chimp best. "What else? Green, dude." The chimp grinned and held up his paw to the elephant, who rolled her eyes and high-fived it with her trunk. "What, as in money, you mean?" asked Rodney interestedly. As the chimpanzee spluttered indignantly in the background, the snail loaded up on a vivid emerald green powder the colour of jungle leaves after a rainfall and began to paint. The ground floor was already covered in old graffiti, layers of scribbles and tags crisscrossing and overlapping each other in a blurred jumble of lines like a faded star map. The snail trailed over them, following now this path, now that, moving from an indecipherable scrawl to part of an angular W to the curve of an inexpertly rendered flower, retracing the ancient lines into a new pattern that sprawled exuberantly from one side to the other. Then he started to climb. It was a bright, clear day, and the others had grouped themselves on the worn stone steps at the front of the house. At some point, the gorilla went back in and retrieved the hash brownie mixture, sucking the wooden spoon thoughtfully before passing the bowl around. The 3rd meerkat, who had been passed out on a beanbag in the living room, woke up and brought out a deck and speakers, and high up on the wall the snail felt the bass thrumming through the brickwork. It was exhilarating, and he climbed higher and higher, making bubbles and hoops that wound around and through one another, breaking every now and then into long spikes that jutted energetically in every direction. The house was a tall one, and the spikes and bubbles became smaller as the snail moved upward, so that from the ground perspective, the walls seemed to be stretching away infinitely into the wide sky. A final series of tiny loops led the snail up to the pointed apex of the gable, and for a moment he hesitated. The wall was finished, but it didn't seem quite right to stop just there. Feeling daring, he pressed on upward, crawling upside down, around and up the fascia, until he emerged on the very top of the roof itself. There, visible only from the air, he completed the line. Looking back down to the street below, he knew a moment of fright. He hadn't realised quite how high he had gone, and even the elephant was toy-sized from his dizzying perch. Then the exhilaration returned in a rush, and he laughed aloud, closing his eyes and tilting his face up to the sun as the chimp came swinging up the drain pipe to fetch him, whooping and hollering all the way. It was late when the party finally wound up. The elephant, giggling madly, escorted the old giraffe home. He had eaten several heaping portions of the brownie mixture without realising what was in it, and had spent much of the evening propped against a wall, blinking his eyes one at a time. And the chimp offered the snail a counter space to crash on. But the snail opted to camp outside and sat on the railing gazing at his completed work as it glowed in the dim sodium light of the street lamp. He felt unaccountably melancholy. He was proud of this piece, just as proud as he'd been of the elephant's house and the giraffe's. He felt that he had captured something of his friends' characters and uniqueness, and he loved being able to make their homes reflect a little more of the beautiful spirits that lived inside them. But he couldn't help feeling a little sad. It seemed ironic that, of all the houses in the world, the only one he could never bring his creative vision to was his own. His little brown shell suddenly seemed drab and ordinary in comparison to the wild green jungle that rose before him, and he found he almost didn't want to be inside it. It was a long time before he went to bed. He was still quiet on Monday when the team met to go over the schedule for the coming week. As they left, Rodney fell back to walk beside him. "Hey, is everything all right?" The snail sighed. "Yeah, I'm fine." Rodney nudged him gently. "You don't look fine. Come on, let's get a coffee." The ant steered him towards the break room and produced 2 dark, aromatic coffee beans from the bottom cupboard. "We'll be bouncing off the walls for the rest of the day, but never mind. Now, spill." Hesitantly, the snail began. He told Rodney all about the joy he felt creating something beautiful for his friends, and his growing sadness that his own home couldn't be part of his creative endeavours. "It feels even worse," he said in a small voice, "because my house is with me wherever I go. It's not just where I live, it's a part of me, and I can't do anything to make it feel like it's truly mine." He nibbled a bit more of his coffee bean. "I know that sounds silly." Rodney was looking at him understandingly. "It's not silly," he said. "I know how you feel. I love my colony, but there I'm just 1 in 12,000, no different from anyone else. I want to be my own person. I even gave myself a name so I could feel like more of an individual, but who's going to call me by it when they can't even tell me apart from everyone else?" Snail felt a little guilty. He'd had no idea Rodney felt this way. He tried to think of something he could say to help. "I'm so sorry, Rodney. I know it's not the same, but if you wanted us to come round and paint your anthill, we could at least..." Rodney smiled. "It's okay. I doubt you'd be allowed anyway. It's all decision by committee round at ours. You'd be in big trouble if you just turned up and started painting willy-nilly. Thanks for the offer, though." He patted the snail gently on the shell. "Hey, why don't you ask the others about your problem, though? I know they can't do the same thing you can, but they're all artists too, even the giraffe in his way. I'm sure they'd be happy to help." The snail mused on Rodney's words for the rest of the morning. Maybe it was the effects of the coffee bean, but he definitely felt cheerier than he had before. And after they'd finished the day's job, repainting the clubhouse of a local Otters Association in their team colours, he took a deep breath and said, "Actually, there's something I wanted to ask you all about." The elephant, the giraffe, and the chimpanzee were full of sympathy, and all 3 of them were most eager to help. Even the giraffe, who was so bashful and muttered so many times that he was not artistic, that the snail insisted he be the first to contribute. The chimp draped a dust sheet over a length of guttering and placed the snail ceremoniously upon it. The giraffe selected his smallest paintbrush, dropping it twice in excitement. Finally, everything was ready. The snail took up his position, broadside onto the giraffe, who held the paintbrush in his mouth and swept it sideways, coating half of not only the snail's shell, but his body as well, in a thick, wobbly layer of uneven paint. Said the giraffe, peering closely at the piebald snail. "Not my finest work, I'm afraid. These fiddly little brushes, you know." The snail, blinking paint out of his eye, agreed that it was definitely the fault of the brush. He looked back at his blodgy, dribbly shell. It was certainly not quite what he had hoped for. The chimp leaned in and examined him critically too. "You got some powerful textures there, man, but maybe you need some figure work in there. Shape and form, right?" The snail nodded gratefully, feeling his heart lift. Shape and form, that was it exactly. The chimpanzee sat the snail on an upended brick like a pedestal. For 10 minutes, he contemplated his canvas from all angles, leaning forward and back and squinting at him so intensely that the snail began to feel distinctly self-conscious. Finally, the chimp extended one paw to the side without removing his gaze from the snail and gestured dramatically to a jar of black paint. The giraffe pushed it respectfully towards him. The chimp dipped his forefinger into it and, with a look of ferocious concentration, made a single round black spot on the very top of the snail's shell. Then he sat back on his haunches with an air of satisfaction. "Surreal, dude." The snail looked back over his shoulder. It certainly was surreal. His shell looked like an imperfectly iced bun with a burnt cherry on top, or perhaps like an eye staring unblinkingly up at the sky. It made him feel strange and not at all comfortable. A little desperate now, he looked up at the elephant. She was looking not at his shell, but at his face, and her expression was a little too understanding. "Perhaps something on a smaller scale," she said. "Still abstract, but with more complexity of line. I wonder." She scratched under her chin thoughtfully and then dipped her trunk into a tub of vibrant magenta paint. "Now, hold still," she warned, moving closer, and the snail crouched as still as he possibly could as she carefully and precisely lowered the very tip of her trunk down directly over his shell. He felt a light, tickling, scratching sensation all over and realized what she was doing. The short, bristly hairs on the inside of her sensitive trunk were covered in paint, and as she very slowly rotated it, they were leaving thin, wiggly lines all over him. Excitement leapt inside him. Then, without warning, the elephant let rip the most enormous sneeze, her ears flapping violently and her trunk stretching and compressing like a squeeze box. The snail, the brick, and the ground around it were completely doused in a jet of magenta, and he gasped and coughed, his vision swimming. "I'm so sorry," wailed the elephant, wiping her streaming eyes with her trunk and leaving a smear of pink across her cheek. "It's just too ticklish." "That's okay," said the poor snail, with a brave attempt at a smile. "Thanks. I think I'll just, go and get cleaned up." And he trailed dolefully away, his eye stalks drooping sadly, and didn't see the worried looks exchanged behind him. The snail washed himself clean under the overflow pipe behind the office, twisting and rubbing against the gravel until his skin stung and his shell was plain and brown once more. Then he wandered on, meandering miserably down the street, the weight of his disappointment pressing upon him as though his shell were filled with lead. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, and it was only when several ants scampered briskly past him that he realized he was right next to the colony where Rodney lived. He came to a stop. There were long streams of ants pouring industriously in and out of the anthill, some giving him hurried nods of greeting, others tramping past without looking up, deep in conversation. But the snail was dismayed to realize that he had no idea whether or not Rodney was among them. The teeming ants really did all look the same. What kind of person was he wondered unhappily, if he couldn't even recognize his friend in a crowd of strangers? But then he heard a shout and looked up to see Rodney hurrying towards him, waving his antennae in greeting. Rodney took one look at the snail's face and led him without a word to a quiet bench away from the crowds. They sat down, and for a while neither of them said anything. "Do you want to talk about it?" asked Rodney eventually. To their mutual horror, the snail felt his eyes begin to water. It just didn't work," he sniffed, and burst into tears. He cried for several minutes, all the bitterness of his disappointment suddenly welling out of him. Rodney sat beside him in silence, and then, as the flood ebbed, handed him a leaf to blow his nose on. Are you okay?" asked the ant tentatively. The snail gave him a watery smile. "I'm fine. I think I'll just go to bed. Thanks, Rodney. And sorry. You don't began Rodney, but the snail had already retreated miserably back inside his shell. After a while, he heard Rodney leave, but he didn't go to sleep. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the rain pattering on his shell. At some point, he must have drifted off into a restless doze, because he was woken by the sound of voices outside. He lay listlessly for a few moments, letting the noises wash over him, and then with a start, he recognized the voices of the rest of his team. He bit his lip, feeling worse than ever. He was still miserable, but to his misery was now added the gnawing of guilt. He knew his friends had tried to help him as best they could, and he felt ashamed to be so ungrateful for their efforts. He didn't want to see their hurt, disappointed faces, and for a wild moment he wondered if he could back quietly away without putting his head out of his shell. But that would be even worse, and so he took a deep breath and emerged slowly, one eye stalk at a time, into the crisp light of the morning. He blinked. The elephant, the giraffe, and the chimpanzee were sitting on the ground under a tree opposite, sipping from takeaway coffee cups and bickering over a paper bag of croissants. They looked up as the snail emerged, but their faces didn't look hurt or disappointed. On the contrary, they all broke into wide grins. The chimp gave a long wolf whistle and pumped his fist in the air, scattering flaky crumbs heedlessly over his own head. "Looking good, little bro," he whooped. "Looking real sharp, brother." The elephant smiled broadly, her eyes shining. "You look wonderful," she said. The giraffe was beaming. The snail stared at them, confused. He had washed all the paint off, hadn't he? Were there some bits round the back he hadn't managed to get? Or, and his heart gave another guilty lurch within him, were they just trying to make him feel better about his own plain, dull shell? Slowly, he twisted his head and looked back at his little house. He gasped. His brown shell was covered in delicate, intricate patterns. Double rows of minuscule dots in white, emerald green, and heather purple looped and wove together like lines of handwriting, some following the shell's spiraling wall, others dipping and zigzagging back and forth along the ridged curves, interlacing so tightly that it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. One row was more solid than the others, all three colours following the same line, so the white dots alternated closely with the green and the purple. It began at the apex of his shell and wound all the way around until it looped on itself just behind the snail's head, forming a somewhat shaky but definitely recognisable circle, his own signature. The snail stared and stared. A lump was forming in his throat. He looked back at his friends who were still grinning at him. "But how did you—" "Ah, here he comes now," said the giraffe, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "The maestro himself. A masterpiece, sir. What an accomplishment." There was a pattering noise behind him, and the snail turned to see Rodney making his way towards them, 2 coffee beans balanced precariously in a cardboard holder. The ant looked tired and dishevelled, his antennae sticking up at mad angles and a smudge of coloured powder on his forehead, but he too was beaming triumphantly. His feet were covered in paint, white and green and purple forming tide marks on his legs, so that he looked as though he were wearing striped socks. He hurried up to the snail. "Do you like it?" he asked eagerly. "I know I'm not an artist or anything, and it's nothing like what you can do, but I just thought—" "I love it," whispered the snail hoarsely. "It's beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much, Rodney." Rodney shuffled his colourful feet shyly. "And thank you all," said the snail, turning to the rest of the team. "Thank you for, well, just thank you." "We're just so glad you're happy," said the elephant softly. "You've brought us so much joy with your beautiful art. We wanted you to be able to have something beautiful for yourself too." "And unique," added Rodney, "something to make you feel like an individual." Just then, a group of ants hurried by on their morning commute. They passed the rest of the team without pause, but when they spotted Rodney, they slowed, whispering to one another. "Hey, cool shoes, Rodney," a couple of them called out, and the others nodded admiringly. Rodney's face glowed as red as a match head. "Thanks," he stammered. The snail grinned. and turned to admire his house again, shining like a polished concher in the sun, dappled and vivid with its fine, intricate complexity of lines. Then he looked back at the rest of the team. The giraffe had a large flake of pastry stuck on his nose, and the elephant was laughing at him and reaching up with her trunk to brush it away. The chimp was tearing a corner off his croissant for Rodney. Feeling more at home than he had ever felt before, the snail went to join his friends for breakfast. The end.
Yeah. I loved it, Frankie. That was amazing.
Oh, it's beautiful.
So lovely.
Like how silly it is.
You're so talented.
I mean, whimsical is just not the word, is it?
I like how they all drink beer and like
hash brownies.
Relatable.
They live in houses. They're so human.
The squirrels in the cohabitation.
Yeah.
I love that they eat coffee beans.
I'm so glad you liked it.
Oh,
Thank you.
lovely.
So good. Like I'm no artist, but that is like same quality as like any of the other stories we read. Like that's just the same. Like it's not like it's so good. It's so good. Like yeah. I mean, it's better than Roald Dahl. I'm just saying that quietly.
So much better.
Does this story happen to be a metaphor for sharing your art with this group of people? Because it kind of feels like it a little bit. As someone who has shared writing with them and like watching this happen, like.
Yeah. I was also thinking, who amongst us is each of those characters? Because that's 500% each. Like, you know, a combination of our personality traits or something like that.
Yeah.
Out with it, Frankie. Out with it.
And the giraffe.
I know who's usually stoned and late.
I did see you making little heart shapes when that was coming up.
I'm going to say that could really have been like a normal, like a regular children's story, but perhaps the drug and alcohol content would maybe push it out of that.
I mean, the moral of the story is to take drugs, right?
Yeah, definitely.
In fact, the moral of the story is to snort paint.
Yes.
It leads to great artistic achievements.
I think just because you need drugs once to do the art doesn't mean you need to keep doing them to make the art.
It's also true.
Exactly. And also, there's absolutely no need to actually bake hash brownies. You can just eat the batter out of a bowl and it's fine.
But Rodney didn't need drugs, so you know.
Quite the time saver.
I love the elephant's thinking progress in terms of the ice cream as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different tubs.
I think I'm definitely the elephant.
I was surprised that the elephant didn't have a tub of victory ice cream for not needing ice cream.
She probably did. Ice cream.
Still want ice cream. So the elephant had one of my favorite lines in it was about the air was blowing as if someone was fanning him with her ears. Just like, what a great simile.
Large papery ears, I think.
Same again, it was so visual. I was there in the story with you. It was magic.
I could see your little face, Mike. Oh, it was very gratifying.
It needs to be a picture book.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, definitely a picture book.
I really want to draw the snails drawings now.
Oh my god, do it!
Let's make the picture book.
Do
I
it.
was hoping someone here would say that.
Picture book. Does anyone know Kezia Weinberg?
No.
In I think they live in California. They're a fusion-y dancer person. And
Is that your drawings with the trousers?
No. They've been doing lots of very sort of angular, geometric type, artistic type drawings, which have been a sort of one every day throughout the lockdown, and it just made me think of those a bit.
That's cool.
I don't actually know if I'll be able to link her page or anything like that.
Do you think we'd be able to get the person that did the trouser drawings to like do a series of drawings of Mike's face while Frankie reads, and then we could all just gaze at them as the most wholesome things ever?
Yes, that is definitely possible.
Lots of money towards that. If a number of people wanted to tip a bit. If Mike was comfortable with it, obviously.
Would you be happy us commissioning pictures of your face, Mike?